It's a pleasure to introduce Michael Eldred, who is an independent researcher based in Cologne, who I met a few years ago. And I've been to visit him in Cologne with his wife Astrid. And so although Michael started in academia and got a PhD in mathematics, in category theory, which we'll maybe talk about in a moment, he left academia but still managed to produce, well, I mean, a very long list of books in very good presses. So he kept up his academic output, probably more so than if he'd stayed in academia, actually. So your list of books is probably more than most academics' lists, and your publications are probably more extensive, I would say. But sort of being independent of academia, he's managed to generate a really original set of interconnected ideas across a variety of themes and fields, and he does them in a way where it's sort of spread across different media. So he has his website at arte-fact.org, and on there you can find not just the work, the novels and the blog, but also these very nice songs that he writes and performs. And the lyrics are great and they're very funny. And this is what drew me to Michael initially, actually, was these songs. So some of his recent books include Tale of the Qua, a philosophical comedy, On Human Temporality, Recasting Whoness Da Capo, Movement and Time in the Cyberworld, Questioning the Digital Cast of Being, and Social Ontology of Whoness, and there are lots more books. And one of the interesting things, Michael, about your work is this terminology. You've sort of devised your own phrases and terminology, which we'll get into, I'm sure, as we go on. And it's I wanted to call it Eldridge, but that's probably not the best terminology, Eldridge. But it's Eldredian or something. And we have terms like interplay and estimation and cast and 3D time, cyberworld, gainful game, and we'll go into some of these things. But there seem to be main themes that go throughout all of your work. So one is this distinction between one-dimensional or linear time and what you call three-dimensional time. There's this distinction between whatness and who-ness. There's this distinction between the gainful game versus interplay and estimation, and sort of the status quo versus da capo. So I'm hoping we'll be able to dip into a few of these different themes. But maybe it's best, because you'll be unfamiliar to many people watching this, for you just to introduce yourself a bit, what the big theme of your work is, how you got to where you are now in your current position, and something about your trajectory from your start in mathematics.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Dean. Just one correction, I did a bachelor's degree in pure mathematics. I then went on to do a master's in pure mathematics with category theory, and then I went on to restart with philosophy. Although I had started with philosophy in 1970, I continued that in 75, and finally I spent a lot of time in Germany, going back and forth between Sydney and Konstanz in the south of Germany to get my PhD in 1984. And the 1984 dissertation is it's an engagement. An engagement with Marx and with Hegel, with Hegel's philosophy of right and Marx's Capital, and it's an attempt to reread Marx's Capital and put it into relationship with the political philosophy of Hegel. And I did this in a research group with three others, Mike Root, Lucia Kleiber and Marnie Hanlon, and we worked out over a long time. It was, in total, you could say 8 years, this reconstruction of Marx, but with my own attempt to extend this capital analysis. What is capital? What is capitalism? How do you get to the essence beyond the the torso that Marx had left behind. So it was a matter of reconstructing that. And then I found, living in Germany, that I had my PhD and no one was interested in employing me. especially because I was associated with Marx, and Marxism was then there was a big rollback in Germany in the 70s and 80s. So that was that. But at least I left Australia and entered another kind of thinking. First of all, it was the speculative thinking of Hegel. And at that stage, it took me years and years to understand what is this speculative thinking supposed to be. What is speculation? What is? It was just a word, and it's a pejorative word in today's English. It is in any kind of thinking which is at all empiricist, and that is what British empiricism is simply taking facts and not digging any deeper. And speculation means digging deeper, going back behind the facts. Then I discovered Heidegger. And Heidegger is a superb phenomenologist, just as Hegel is. Hegel is much more difficult because his terminology is very difficult. And there is a more of a lucidity in much of Heidegger, especially in his early lectures in the 1920s. They're just beautifully clear lectures in a phenomenological way. And you could see him learning himself how to read Aristotle, how to reread Aristotle. So he's doing his own Da Capo because he's out to explore what is the meaning of being itself, and not the metaphysical efforts of Aristotle to investigate the being as being. So it's the being, or you'd say the being as beings. I prefer to say the being as a being. So it's concentrated on beings or Zionist things, and Heidegger's impulse is to say, well, what does being itself mean? Independently, or before, or prior to beings. So that was his thing, and then he actually then makes a pivot by noticing that in Aristotle there's an implicit meaning of being. Also with Plato, there's an implicit meaning of being, and that is presence. It's Anwesenheit, the presence of, and of course with Aristotle, it's the presence of the present, so, or the being of the being. So there's this connection with time. So you find his great work, his most famous work, Sein und Zeit, Being in Time, is really exploring the implicit meaning with the Greeks is that being means time in a certain way. What is this certain way? How is this phenomenon of time to be brought to light? Which he does, and you can see him working his way through this question, or like it's all to do with trying to write this thing called being, this work called Being in Time. And Aristotle is the one great source for that, and the other great source is Kant, Immanuel Kant. And he finds that in Immanuel Kant's is his critique of pure reason, that there is a implicit discovery of three-dimensional time in there, and you have to dig that out. And he does that by reconstructing in a phenomenological way what Kant does with the power of imagination. In German, that's called Einbildungskraft. So there's this Einbildungskraft, you've got a building, and the way in which Kant unfolds what this Einbildungskraft, or power of imagination, is that you have a prototype of three-dimensional time. So he's got, that's one of the big, enormous pieces of his jigsaw puzzle that he's trying to put together. Like, what does time mean, but not in this trivial sense, which has been accepted ever since Aristotle, that it is a number that is read off physical movement. So he's...
So maybe, I mean, so we're jumping a bit to very substantive issues here. I mean, people are not going to know what you mean by three-dimensional time, so maybe it's worth going into that in a bit of detail.
I think, but that's the main thing. I think if I can, in this interview with you, if I can make that at all clear about what it's all about, why it's necessary to go back to the beginning, da capo, to the most elementary phenomena. And I'm claiming, my claim is that in contrast to Hegel, who starts with being and nothingness, I'm saying if we take Heidegger's first answer to in being and time is to say that the meaning of being is actually time, temporality. And I'm saying Heidegger gets that far, gets stuck, and he tosses that. He actually tosses that and switches to the truth of being. The truth of, so the Die Wahrheit des Seins, the truth of being, kind of replaces and eclipses this emphasis on time, which he works out to a certain extent in being and time as Zeitlichkeit, so it would be translated timeliness. So I'm saying, okay, let's take that as the starting point. This is the most elementary phenomenon we can approach. And the elementary nature of it is that we can actually look at this phenomenon without making any presuppositions. So that it's open to anybody starting to read Eldred or say Eldred's On Human Temporality. Its claim is to be phenomenological, and it's just looking at very simple phenomena and saying, well, what do we see there? What do we see there? And I'm saying, just imagine yourself. Some things come to mind and they leave your mind, and they come to mind from one of three dimensions of time. They come from the past, they come from the present, and they come from the future. Things just occur to mind. Very simple observation. And I'm saying that these three dimensions are first to be taken as empty, like there's nothing in them. Like they are the things that enable that something comes to mind. These dimensions, because the dimension is the possibility of passing through or traversing. So you have to go back to the original meaning of the Greek word dimension, which means to traverse. So things come to mind and they disappear from mind. And I can take it.
Does that not already suggest some sort of linearity, though? I mean, the fact that you've distinguished into past and future and present dimensions, is there not some pre-existing linearity?
No, because it's not, because your mind, what comes to mind can come from any of the three dimensions in any sort of higgledy-piggledy form. It's not that one event follows another, but that we can, the mind, I'm talking about the mind now, and its own peculiar kind of movement, and anybody can experience them for themselves, like just by considering that. It's not introspection, nor is it outrospection. There's no in and out here. There's simply things come to mind, and from any of the three dimensions of time, and there's no claim that what comes to mind from the future has anything at all to do, first of all, with what comes from the past or from the present. And I'll give you one one way of beginning to look at this is to take a simple example, and one I like or have come to like recently is of listening to music. Like you can listen to music in the present, like it comes to your ears and it's an audio phenomenon, and it can be Beethoven, it can be a pop song, it can be anything you like. You're listening to it with your ears, so it's audio. But you can also listen to music from the past, from your memory. You can have a whole song or a whole movement of Beethoven or whatever, depending on your competence with music or what you know about it. You can have that just run in your mind, and you actually listen to that music in your mind. But then there is also the third aspect where music comes to you from the future. And this is the case with composers, any sorts of, or songwriters, whatever you like. You have music coming to your mind from the future. And the thing I'd like to point out here is that Beethoven became tone deaf in his later years. And that is when he wrote his string quartets, his famous string quartets. And he heard this music from the future. And he didn't need ears.
Why do you say he heard it from the future,
because
though?
It's coming here, because
How do you
it's
get that?
coming to him as unheard, like it's new. It is creative. It's creating something new that can only come from the future. Like if it was not new, it would come from the past, or it would be coming from the present because it was already there. But here it's coming from the future, in that it's unheard of. Like so, and this is what you see.
Yeah. So you mean that anything genuinely novel has to, by definition, be coming from the future because it can't come from anywhere else. But does that not mean that it's not an open future? That makes it sound like it's there in the future and being transmitted, or
it comes to us from this open future. Like there's no way in which we can summon up what is to come from the future, but it is genuinely creative of something new, that it's not just a repetition. It's not being generated from what is already there, but is genuinely other. And that's what I'd say with a great composer such as Beethoven, who is writing these string quartets, and he's deaf. It's interesting to see that hearing is not in the first place. It's not a matter of having ears. We do not hear because we have ears, but we have ears because we hear. And this hearing that we have is three-dimensional in the temporal sense. That is, we hear from the past, we hear from the present, and we hear from the future. And the third aspect, the one from the future, is the really interesting one, because that is where the imagination comes into play as creative.
Okay, so I want to just sort of go a bit deeper into this, because I agree with you that, what's going on with compositions like the ones from Beethoven is that there is genuine creation going on. But then how I would explain it is that there is, it's because there is a potentiality. So there's another layer of reality beyond this present experience, something like Aristotle's potential being. And the pieces of music are, in some sense, located, if they have a location, in that potentiality. But you don't seem to want to say that there's this additional thing, which is potential being. It would be something like Aristotle's potential being, right? You seem to want to say that the most elementary thing is just this presence.
Well, presence in this temporally three-dimensional sense. And if you want to put that into relationship with potential or dunamis is the way in which Aristotle thinks it through, and I think he's very close to the mark. He does it very, very simple. He's a very good phenomenologist, Aristotle. That's why he's so dry, and people complain about his dry style. But he says that a potential, a dunamis, is a starting point for a change in something else, or else he makes a proviso, or it's in the same thing insofar it is as something else. So it's the starting point for a change. So it's
But there are two things. But there are two things going on, right? There's one is that there is this potentiality, a space of real possibilities in some sense. And then the other is that then one of those things seems to happen. So Beethoven could stumble across all manner of string quartets, but there was one particular one that he got access to, right? So there's a question of how you get from one thing to the other thing. How does it come about that this novel creation occurs from this state of potential?
Yeah, well, that's where you get into the difficulties of Aristotle's conception of potential, because the whole thing about Aristotelian potential, dunamis, is that it is tied into a particular kind of movement. The ontology in which Aristotle develops, and he does that in Book Theta of the Metaphysics, but it's also it's the grounding that lies behind his whole physics, is that he's got an ontology of physical movement. So it's the physical movement which is front and center, and all these concepts that he develops, dunamis, energia, and entelechia, are fashioned according to this paradigm of a productive kind of movement. So in that you have an efficient cause, you have a material cause, you've got an eidetic cause or a formal cause, and you've got a telos, an end, where it comes to an end. So he's got this fourfold, which has been boiled down to just two in more modern physics. But you've got to realize that the paradigm he's got there is physical movement. And what I'm saying from the get-go is that, no, don't restrict your sight to movements of things that can be causally explained as kinds of, as analog or physical movements themselves. Because when you've got physical movement, you're also back in traditional Aristotelian territory, because for him a physical movement is the movement of something material, so extended material, and it also has a look, an eidos. And the eidos is simply the look of an individual thing, like you look at a pen, you see a pen, but it's also the look of something is twofold. It's first of all this trivial, like the factual look. This is a pen. No one's going to. But then you can go further and say, well, what is a pen? And then you go into what is its whatness. And that is the big theme of Aristotelian ontology, is to dig deeper and say, well, what is the whatness of this thing? And there you have the corresponding ontology. And I'm saying, well, don't leave that alone for the moment. Let's just stick to this elementary movement of the mind and not bring all this apparatus into play, and take that something, that a new idea, like idea in the Platonic sense, that a new look of things can actually pop up from the future without wanting to explain it in any kind of causal way. And once you nail it down to say it is a dunamis, a potential that is being realized, you're already foreshortening this openness of the future. So don't try to explain it away. Just stick with that and see how the story unfolds from there. So I'm saying the physical, the Western thinking from the get-go with Plato and Aristotle, they are very much concerned with the phenomenon of movement and being, the being of movement. What is the being of movement? How does it present itself to the mind? And also with concurrently, what is time? And what is the relationship between this movement and time? And it's very plain, if you look at Aristotle, that time is conceived as something derivative of physical movement. It's a counting of movement. And I'm saying, well, that's already narrowing the view. You're fencing yourself in by saying that, well, in some way or other, all movement is physical, which it isn't. Like, if you just think about it, it's not every movement is physical, and it's also saying that it is movement which needs time. And I'm saying this time is this primordial or originary openness for the world. Time is this originary openness for the world itself, that it can actually present itself to us. And this timely openness in this three-dimensional way is what is rudimentary and elementary and fundamental. And from there you can get to all these other phenomena. But the movement really becomes interesting from the start, just by looking at what comes to mind is this mental movement, which is the most elementary kind of movement. But I'm not claiming that this mental kind of movement is somehow got a physical underlay which actually causes it, which is just giving way to Western way of thinking about movement, starting from physical material movement. And that's where we've ended up today.
Do you know, it's funny because you wrote a thing about Ian McGilchrist, whose view, you take him to be an empiricist, but he's saying something so similar to what you just said in your past spiel there. The idea is that there's the right brain, hang on, there's the right brain, which is kind of, or is it the left brain, which is focused on causality, production, control, linearity, time, and he associates it with the West. And the problems with the West, he traces back to this cluster of ideas that he also associates with people with the Greeks, basically. And he suggests that we need to bring in this more receptive feminine, because a lot of the concepts you mentioned are basically masculine, right? More feminine concepts of receptivity, possibility, and those sorts of notions. And to do this, he has this larger concept of mind that sounds quite a lot like what you mean by three-dimensional time. So I wouldn't write him off quite so quickly, because it seems there's a bit of commonality, I think, more than you are willing to admit.
I don't know. Well, I don't know. I just took some of the formulations which he uses, and when you say that the left half of the brain is talking to the right half of the brain, then I say, what? But the brain is a piece of flesh, like a very complicated. It's physical. No. So you cannot talk about.
That's not how to think about it, though. You have to forget about the brain itself and think in terms of the different modes of attention that the brain happens to generate. So just like we have ears because we need to hear, we have a brain because there were different ways of thinking that require a brain with different, with some split off elements, right? Which seems to be required by polarity being needed for existence and manifest reality. So it's not so much that the brain is necessary. It's that there are different ways of viewing, of attending to the world. You can either attend to it as to use your expression, the gainful game, as something that you can get stuff from, to acquire, or you can have some more interplay approach. So again, this is all in his The Matter with Things book, where he's against things and objectivity and the idea of objects and matter.
I'd turn that on its head by saying that we don't think because we have a brain. We have a brain because we think. This would be.
He says the same thing.
Okay, I don't care. I don't care. I just say you've got to be careful about what you say, because when you start talking about a part of the brain talking to the other half of the brain, then I'm saying you're talking nonsense. Okay, you have to do this. You have to be a little bit more subtle and get away from it. First of all, getting away from the side that there's a cause behind everything. Because when you keep in mind that our fundamental or our primitive notion of cause is a material effective cause, and that we've been lost in this labyrinth of just finding causes and causes and causes, so that we end up explaining the mind in terms of the brain, which is we're stuck in that now. We're stuck in that way of thinking.
Yep, I agree.
So,
something else, I have this problem of sort of trying to find other approaches that look similar to various people's approaches. I can't help it. But there's a nice quote by Robert Flood, who was reviewing Kepler's Harmonia Mundi book. And he said, it's for the vulgar to concern themselves with quantitative shadows, i.e. mathematics. The alchemists and the hermetic philosophers comprehend the true core of the natural bodies. So there's something very alchemical about what you're talking about, where they have the male and the female aspects, right? And the male aspects would be causality and linearity and production. And then the female aspect, and creation from nothing, right, which is another big thing, which goes back to the Aristotle idea. But they also have the idea of a creatio continua, this continuous creation or possibility, which is then the feminine side. But then the idea is you need both, right, to then generate things, the world, as it appears. So what is your view on how we get to the generation of things, of a world in which we seem to inhabit? Because you have a very interesting version of this, I think, which, if I understand it rightly, is your cast of being. Seems to be something like this idea that you are playing with this potentiality to generate something, a cast of being. How do you see it?
I don't frame it in terms of the potentiality. I frame it in terms of, first of all, like once we have put our foot in this realm of three-dimensional time and realize that things appear to our mind and are understood in some way or other. So this is where the hermeneutic aspect comes into play, and say that everything which comes to mind in some way might be fleeting and might be standard, can be physical things, it can be social things, it can be like a law or whatever. Whatever it is understood in some way or another as such and such. And this as is what I understand, following very much Heidegger there, that there's the hermeneutic as, which is also known as the qua, the hermeneutic qua, being as being, to
Mm-hmm.
on he on. And I interpret this to on he on, so the being as being. I interpret this, or I read this second being simply as a present participle. And the participation of this present participle, I say, is the participation in time. And in this time, it shapes up with a certain look. It shapes up with a certain look. So the mind sees this certain look of whatever is showing up and understands it in some way or another. So
Okay, but now we seem to have, but we've got two things again, right? We have two things, and Heidegger had this same problem where 3D time or presence or whatever is not enough on its own, right? Because that would just be this, it would have no being. It would be, a particular kind of being, but it wouldn't be being as being. For that, you need an additional thing. So it looks like there needs to be 3D time
yeah,
plus a mind to
no,
which it
the
appeals.
mind, like I can see
So
that
what?
the three-dimensional time is that to which the psyche belongs, and this is the first concept of the psyche, is this belonging to three-dimensional time. And the psyche has this faculty. I understand the mind as a faculty within the psyche, as this encompassing three-dimensional time. And it is the mind as this understanding faculty of the psyche itself that is able then to bring an understanding of all that appears in a certain cast, hermeneutic cast, so that the world as a whole, in some kind of interconnected way, which has to be thought through, the world as a whole shapes up in a scaffolding of ideas. And these ideas are the looks of things in a certain historical epoch. So I say, so in Greece, they have, in ancient Greece, there is no experience of an historical change on a momentous basis. They're kind of starting from scratch and saying, well, this is the way the world shapes up. And with Aristotle and Plato, you have this metaphysical way of understanding the world, where physical movement takes kind of pride of place, and you conceive time simply as this linear time with, well, that happens and then that happens and then that happens, and these are physical happenings. So from that comes a whole cast of being, in which, like, material, of course, plays a foundational role, but it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's
This hermeneutic cast of that age is not unchangeable. It is historical in this large sense that there are historical times, and with regard to Western thinking, you could say there are basically three, like starting with the ancient Greece, and you've got this long interregnum or period in between, which you roughly characterize as Christianity. And then you've got the modern age, or the new age, starting in the 17th century, where this whole new cast of being emerges under the leadership of a mathematical, scientific way of approaching all the phenomena. So you've got the phenomena being mathematized, which is the march of triumph of modern science starts there. So that's I'm just saying the hermeneutic casts are the ways in which an historical epoch can be characterized as dominated, and it's dominated for the mind of that age, because these elementary phenomena seem so self-evident to be understood in that way that you can't get beyond it.
so hang on. So before we go on, so the notion of the elementary phenomena, I mean, that's a tricky one in itself. So what for you would be an example of something elementary in this sense?
Well, I'm claiming that the most elementary phenomenon is the phenomenon of three-dimensional time itself. Like it's immediately accessible to anybody just starting to mull it over, that we do have these three dimensions of time, and these three dimensions of time are not dimensions that kind of line up along a line, but they are the dimensions that can the source from which things come to mind. So that's why there is also a fourth dimension of time, is that this three-dimensional time itself passes through what could be called the fourth dimension of time. It traverses this to become one with the psyche, within which everything that appears or traverses from any one of the three dimensions is then understood in a certain way. And this basic understanding of what they are or who they are is already an historical cast. And to see that, it's interesting to look at ancient thinking, ancient Greek thinking, which actually starts with a cast of being that is fixated upon physical movement, and its questions regarding the being of the beings is focused also upon these physical things in the first place. And when it goes to explicate the being of the being, it comes to saying, well, that we say what it is, it's whatness. And then you have this wonderful...
Exactly, but... Okay.
That's the interesting thing about Aristotle. Yeah. He has this this very important concept of TNNI, the what it wasness. The what it wasness is. It's whatness as a being. So the whole concentration of Greek thought is on this whatness. And although you cannot avoid the phenomenality of whoness, and it actually does crop up in Greek thinking, and it crops up mainly in the so-called ethics, and it crops up under the concept of time, esteem, estimation, value, how we value things. It's there, and it's talked about. Plato talks about time lots and lots and lots of times, but it's never brought to its concept. In contrast to physical being brought to its concept as kinds of whatness. So there's a discrepancy there.
Yeah. So at the moment, so I'm just trying to get a grip still on it, because it's sounding a lot like something Aristotelian again. Like there's the prima materia, and it doesn't have any form itself, but we overlay some interpretation, and we view it as something. And the way we as humans seem to work is that we generate a shared notion of what that as thing is, the beings, and then we almost perform like a cast, a segment of history, right? Where this is how things are. We're doing a performance as if the world is one-dimensional, linear, time-based, and we're all made of matter. But that's not the only way of interpreting it, and we might be able to change it and say, actually, no, we're not material beings. And there's other ways of interpreting this very basic, elementary, whatever it is, without form. How does that sound?
Yeah, I'm saying, you don't get hung up on matter. Because time is nothing material. Time, this openness of time, this three-dimensional time, there's simply this openness to the world. Our human openness to the world is you can say it's prior to any material. Yes. Keep it free from that of bringing in material, because then you're stuck with the problem of material. It is extended. It has there's three dimensions.
I mean, prime material in the sense of something with pure potentiality to be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be materialized as matter. But again, there seems to be, in your view, something like a space of potential being, which is then interacts with the mind in some way to generate what we would think of as actual being. But the actual being is not necessary. It's contingent to a particular historical period. Is that more correct?
Yeah. I try to say that without using the concepts of potentiality and actuality. I simply say that this openness of time is the source of our openness to the world. Everything that shows itself to us as phenomena is already temporal. So temporality in this pre-material sense is prior to space, for example. And space is what is needed by physical beings. Physical beings require space to be somewhere. So that's why you have topos in Greek thinking. That is the way they deal with physical beings, that physical beings have to be somewhere. But things, purely temporal things, do not have to be necessarily somewhere at all. They can be pre-spatial. So
what about comparing? I mean, you've mentioned the imagination a few times, and another thing it's reminding me of is the imaginal world that you find in a lot of Arabic scholars, actually. Ibn Arabi has this idea that there's existence and non-existence. You probably don't agree with that bit. And then there's this middle world called the barzakh, which is imaginal. It's imaginary, but you still can have a kind of body there. It's just not physical body and things like this, and it's not really located in any sense. Would an imaginal realm sound about right?
Yeah, imaginary in relationship to this three-dimensional time. I call it the power of imagination, but the most interesting aspect of the power of the imagination is its dimension toward the future, or from the future. So this is where the imaginary comes into play, where you can have imaginary works of art, say. Like you have novels. You can have novels which is purely a work of the imagination, where an author is allowing the imaginations or the images or the looks of things from a future to come to mind and put it into a narrative form of some kind. So that's a very important aspect of three-dimensional time, is this dimension of the future, which is the imaginary dimension in the usual sense, being created.
Why does it need to come? Why do you need to have it come from the future rather than from nowhere, in particular?
I'd say.
Does it not pin it down a bit too much?
I say the future. The future is the dimension par excellence for that which was not yet there. So when something pops up, creative in a genuine sense, then it's not a violence to language to say, well, it's futural, like it's coming.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I'm not saying the future is kind of active dimensions, but it's allowing something to come through. So this traversing idea, the dimension is that which allows a passing through. So it's pre-mathematical. Like, there's warning there, not to try and understand these three dimensions of time in any kind of mathematical sense, because mathematics has already absconded with the phenomenal content. It's already reduced it.
Yeah, I mean, it might be worth going into a bit of your views on mathematics, since you mentioned that. I mean, it's funny, since you started off in mathematics, but you were in a particular branch of mathematics that almost matches your later trajectory. So category theory is very different from set theory, right? In many of the ways that you've been describing with philosophy. So I mean, so what do you find is the problem with mathematics and mathematicized science, and how do we get out of it?
Yeah, I tried to do this with a misappropriation of Shakespeare's Hamlet soliloquy by saying that thus mathematization does make idiots of us all, and thus the native hue of the phenomena is sickly daub with a pale cast of models, and changes of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the urge of necessity. So that's a way of saying that my plea is the urgency of necessity is to learn to see these things anew. And you can't do that with mathematics. And that's the trick of mathematics, and it accounts for its success, is that so as soon as you turn a phenomenon into something mathematical, it simply becomes a symbol that you can shift around and move and so on according to mathematical rules. So you don't have a view anymore of the phenomenon itself. And that is the upshot. That is the upshot of my whole engagement with this whole thing about quantum indeterminacy, is to say, like you've lost it. As soon as it becomes mathematical, you've got no chance. You've got no chance, baby. You've got to go back to the simple phenomena themselves and see, crucially, and this is what quantum theory itself made out, is a real desideratum of this quantum gravity theory that has been trying to do for over a century, is that they realize, like Wheeler says it explicitly, there is a problem with time. But he's not the only one. They're saying that time, it's a problem. So you've got these attempts to just get rid of time altogether. And say, yeah, that's right. So take another look at time itself and look at what you understand by time. Its mathematization as a real variable. T is a disaster. So go back to what is this linear time? So it's a linearization then in a mathematical sense, when you turn into a real number, and you've got the continuum, and you've got the whole mathematics of the continuum there loaded upon this implicitly upon the phenomenon. But if you go back to the simple phenomenon itself, it is nothing of the kind. It's, and I've said it is this three-dimensional openness. And we humans, well, that's a question of how we humans are open to the world by belonging to time. And so that we see the world ourselves in a temporarily threefold way. We see simultaneously is a misuse of the word, but we see all at once. We see all at once into all three dimensions of time. And that is the condition of possibility that we can see movement at all, because movement is never simply a fixation in a certain place at an instant of time. And the conception of time as a series of instants of time, like one arriving and then immediately being replaced by the next and so on, this constant continuous disappearance of time from the present moment, it's a consequence of narrowing the view of the world to time in the present. And you have the corresponding thing with, already in Greek thinking, that you have the way which is supposed to be the access to the openness to the world is the aesthesis, the sense perception in the present, because the senses, as we know, they work in the present. Like they've got to receive data from the present. And so you've got all this thing about the data coming in from the outside, being worked up by the organs of perception, and then we see something. as putting that as fundamental. I'm saying once you put that as fundamental, then you're lost, baby. You really got to go back to know what is before that, what is prior to that, and realize that we have a three-dimensional temporal access to the world, and that we actually see in the sense of understand, three-dimensionally. And it's only by virtue of that that we can see the world at all, or see the world and see movement in the world, because the world is a world of movement. And that is what the cardinal failure of quantum theory and quantum indeterminacy and its interpretation is. In order to come to this quandary and this paradox and this craziness of quantum indeterminacy, you have to think it on the basis of conceiving time as a sequence of instants. But if time is not this sequence of instants, but it is our mathematical modeling and reduction of time to something mathematical to make it calculable, because that's the whole point of calculation, of reducing time to a real variable, because once you've got a real variable, then you can predict. And that is what they call the so-called collapse, the collapse of the quantum wave. No, you put it in different ways, but the collapse of the wave into an observable, which is real, then you need a real number. Right? And then they use the imaginary numbers as a kind of auxiliary to get that way. But it still does not break with the conception of time as a sequence, as a succession of instants of time. And once you get rid of that, then you've got rid of the paradox of quantum indeterminacy.
But it did initially, right? It could have gone a completely different way, and the early people working on it, like Niels Bohr and whatnot, were calling it acausal. There was a problem with space-time trajectories in that they made no sense whatsoever. And it wasn't until the empirical interpretation that Max Born gave it, which is this probability interpretation, that it became linearized again. So the measurable stuff became linearized, and then there was this strange stuff going on when it wasn't being measured, and it almost behaved according to what you're talking about when not measured, right? It's in a strange potentiality. There's no time and space. There's no matter, really, because it doesn't have a location yet, even, the matter. So it can't really be concrete or material in any way.
No, that is in line with this conception of three-dimensional time, because it's pre-material. Like you can't talk about time as being at all material, and it is the space that is open to the mind. So it's always you don't want to separate this reality or whatever you want to call it out there vis-a-vis us humans, because it's simply a matter, how do we humans understand the world? So never try to separate and say that there's a world separate from us, because it's always a matter of our interpretation. So it's simply how adequate is our interpretation of the world? How adequate is it to the phenomena themselves when we get close to them? So never try to make the phenomena somehow out there. You know, they do their own thing. They don't.
I mean, again, the early quantum theorists would agree with you, right? Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger wrote on the problem of removing the observer and the human from the theories. Thought it was a ridiculous idea not to remember that this is our sensory experience that we're formalizing and whatnot. And I noticed you gave John Wheeler a hard time in your Time and Movement in the Cyberworld book. You have a load of appendices, and John Wheeler gets a bit of a hard time. But I think Wheeler basically what Wheeler was doing was making into something more substantial what Niels Bohr was trying to do. But Niels Bohr said it was epistemological. We just don't know the nature of things. Whereas Wheeler said, no, the nature of things is that it's in this strange, spaceless, timeless, materiallessness state until we do something, until we interact with it. So that doesn't sound a million miles away from something you're saying.
I object to talking about it as timeless, because the only thing we have as humans is time. This openness of time is where the world is. It shapes up in this three-dimensional time. So it makes no sense to talk about any sort of timelessness, because we humans are not capable of stepping outside this openness of time, this three-dimensional openness of time. And any attempt to do so automatically brings what we try to think about outside time within time, because it presences for our mind. So it's...
Yeah, I know. I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's a tricky thing to deal with ontologies like this. This is why I was trying to see whether you believed in something outside of time as presencing to us. Because if you have this continuous recasting of being, then there must be something that is being recast, right? Another thing, which I would think that other thing is the spaceless, timeless, materialless thing that we are putting into form almost with our hermeneutic as is.
No, I just say this is simply the shaping up of another interpretation of the world. And it's always time, it's always temporal. That's why I have given up. I don't no longer then talk about ontology, but temporality, to make it strict. You can't avoid. I can't avoid talking about ontology, because that's the traditional. But I'm saying we need to move beyond ontology by realizing that anything that is nur, is only because it shapes up and shows itself within this temporal openness for the mind.
Yeah,
So
I agree with that. But then it seems that if given the kind of ways that happens, and the fact that there are very different ways that, even conflicting ways that it can happen, doesn't it suggest a sort of transcendental argument that there's something else underlying it? You don't think that, though? Or you just think we can't?
That would be to take a kind of Kantian path and say that there's this Ding an sich, this thing in itself, that is unknowable. So
but it's not.
Keep your fingers off it.
It's not a thing. But it's not a thing, though, is it? There's no thingness about it. That's the point. It has no thingness or form whatsoever.
It's beyond the bounds of what humans can experience at all. So let's just stick to what we humans experience and how we interpret what we experience, and see that there are better and worse interpretations of what we experience, and that the way in which we interpret the most elementary phenomena has a carryover. Like if we interpret the most elementary phenomena in an inadequate way, then we're going to get a whole cast of being, or hermeneutic cast of the world that is out of whack. And I'd say this is what has happened in the modern age. Is our interpretation of the world is out of whack. We're starting with our attempt to understand everything in terms of physical movement, and then ending with the disasters we're in at the moment.
Yeah. So when you say out of whack and better or worse, though, you don't mean relative to something. You just mean internally it's making it a bad situation. Because so what are we to make of truth in this case then? Is there such a thing as truth in your scheme? Or is it all hermeneutic?
There is truth, but it is only ever hermeneutic truth, so it's always provisional. It's always historical. It's always a matter of how well our mind I'm talking about just a singular mind of an historical epoch comes to terms with the phenomena and gives it an adequate interpretation. So that there is always controversy, of course, over the interpretation of the phenomena, starting with the most elementary, and the interpretation of the most elementary phenomena is the most consequential because of the consequences it has. So, that's where we can kind of perhaps move on simply from physical movement and mental movement to the next big stage, or the next stage of my thinking is turning toward how we humans get along with each other in the world. We share the world with each other, and this sharing of the world is its own kind of movement. And the attempt...
But it's also a shared construction, right?
Yeah.
It's like we are literally constructing the thing. It's almost like a mental projection of sorts. Not quite.
It's a mental. It's certainly a cast. I don't say it's projection. I'd say it would be. We have a certain historical interpretive cast of the world, like you're born into it. But there are these momentous historical changes when this historical cast of world becomes questionable. And that's the role of the thinkers, of the philosophers, or whatever you want to call them. I'd say the phenomenologists who try to get close to the phenomena, of kind of to try to come to a more adequate interpretation of the basic elementary phenomena, and therefore starting with that of the whole world. But it's building, like how it's built from certain key ideas. So this idea of scaffolding as a framework, a building built of ideas through which we understand the world, and first of all have no choice. We have no choice. Like that's the world we're thrown into. So in the West, we're thrown into a certain interpretive cast of world, and if you're born somewhere else, it's not so cut and dried. But I don't say any. I don't attempt to say anything about these alternative casts of world. Like they are there. You can say they're empirically there, but I don't know enough about them, and I'm concerned with this. I'm concerned with an alternative cast of mind in the Western sense, in coming to terms with our own traditions of thinking. So the whole idea of social movement, how we have dealings with one another, how is this kind of movement to be characterized and interpreted at all? And the one point is to say that even starting with physical things, that we start with anything we understand, we also esteem or evaluate or value in some way or another. And this evaluation or estimation always covers a whole spectrum, the negative to the positive. Right? We say something is useful, we say it's useless, we say something is pleasant, going through to unpleasant, something is beautiful, ugly, so on. And these are all different kinds of ways in which we estimate or value things. So this estimation is a very important phenomenon to conceptualize, and it leads into, well, how do we estimate each other, and that in turn requires that we focus upon what distinguishes what from whom, because all the Western thinking has been concentrated on what is the whatness of the whats, even to the extent that the who-ness of the who becomes the whatness of the what. Right. So the human being being conceived as a subject, the human being being conceived as a subject who is endowed with consciousness is more, you can say that it is already a reduction to a kind of what. And that is the kinds of what that psychology, modern psychology, then starts studies by actually trying to measure it and so on, bring all this into dimensions of whatness that are nicely measurable and pseudo scientific, and that's what it's all about. And with psychology, it's the same as with the physical sciences, that the psychology is also fixated upon prediction. Like it's always a matter of predicting behavior and so forth. Like it's just taken for granted as self-evident. The science has to be concerned with predicting movement, and if you're only concerned with predicting movement, all you need is linear time, because in a way you're saying implicitly, if not explicitly, there are certain causes, and this will be the outcome. So you can also say that in psychology, you have these causes, and that will be the outcome. And once you've got cause and effect going, you've actually got linear time going again.
And it's much easier to sell people pharmaceutical drugs as well that way, if you know what it's going to do.
Yeah, like it's a really bad shape, because by reducing the mind to the brain as something bodily, and then saying that states of mind are actually only states of the brain, the molecules in the brain, and we can knock them around a bit with pharmaceuticals. And we've discovered experimentally that certain the things called hormones, and if you've got one hormone and this other hormone, then you feel happy, and then you reduced yourself to a material thing that can be manipulated by certain sorts of chemicals, which is not.
But it sort of makes a similar mistake in another direction, which you've also written quite a bit on, which is it also makes us say silly things about AI, that AI has the same status. Whereas if we weren't thinking about ourselves as what's and things that can be quantified like this, we would never make such silly statements in the first place, because we would see straight away, no, that's just a piece of matter. There's no who-ness to it.
Exactly. So that was my thing about introducing this word who-ness, and nobody seems to like it. But
it sounds too much like a Dr. Seuss novel, I think.
But the who-ness was for me the real pivot, and it comes. And that is where this is where Marx really came back to me, because I've done so much work on Marx, and he focuses upon exchange, the exchange of commodity for commodity or commodity for money, which is his paradigm for what I would now call interplay, and that is in contrast to what Aristotle takes as his paradigm for movement, which he takes to be some kind of making, poiesis, making something. Gives his paradigm for physical movement, from which he fashions his whole ontology of movement with dunamis, energeia, and entelechia. He does that. What Marx does is he does his what has come to be known as the value form analysis. So I go back to that and say, this is another kind of paradigm for movement, because here we do not have, as with Aristotle, we do not have a single starting point for a movement. So in Aristotle, the starting point for a movement is a dunamis, so it's a power or a force. So you don't just have one force. And if you've got one force, then you say, well, from this force proceeds that change, And then you've got a causal connection. The starting point is not only the starting point, but it is also the cause of the change. So you're off to the races there with causal explanation. But if you start with this prototypical paradigmatic situation that you've got a buyer meeting a seller on the market, you've got two starting points. And there's no way, except by sleight of hand, where that you can actually reduce two starting points, two independent starting points to one. So all you have left is an interplay in which either it comes to an exchange or it doesn't. So it's non-predictive. It's non-predictive, but that doesn't mean that it's not consequential, because that is the way in which, in the economic sense, the whole association, what I call association of society, takes place through this multitude, this endless multitude of exchanges. But it doesn't stick to money for commodity. It goes on. There are other things that have value which also have to come into economic play. So that would be the economic interplay, which is itself based upon a whole interplay of mutual estimation, but first of all related to things. When I'm saying in society, in the way we have to do with each other, even before to that, more fundamental and elementary, is that we cannot help in any kind of having to do with each other, in any kind of encounter, whether it's fleeting or deeper or whatever, we cannot help but evaluate and estimate in some way. And this, in turn, covers the whole spectrum from positive to negative. And so to love someone is the opposite as to hate someone, or to like the way someone looks is the opposite, saying very unattractive. So unattractive. So that's all in the physical appearance, but also in assessing each other's abilities. Like you cannot do otherwise than notice whether someone has ability or not ability, or in which dimension this ability goes, and whether they're useless, they're unable in some way. So this continuous interplay of mutual evaluation and estimation is what is at the heart of our association with each other in society. So that's what I explore in this thick book on sociology of whoness, is to explore the different dimensions of, starting with this very basic phenomenon of how we estimate each other in some way or another, or in some ways or another, in, first of all, in kind of personal encounter. And I'm saying that is not compatible. That is not compatible with the Western scientific way of approaching the phenomena. Like you.
Yeah, so you're saying, so the idea is that our systems and institutions don't reflect the most basic aspects of human society, as in our economic systems and these kinds of things.
Yeah, I'm saying you can't get rid of a phenomena themselves because they're staring in the face. The question is whether you take notice of them. And if you try to convert this simple evaluation of each other and esteeming of each other into some kind of quantifiable scientific, psychological business, then you've lost the phenomenon there. I'm saying let's go back to the simple phenomena themselves and say what is most important for the society is our interplay with each other, and the quality of this interplay is, and whether we come to adequate and fair appreciation of each other.
But Michael, how do we make money from this?
Yeah, but the thing that comes in on top is what you say, money, because this is this whole other underlying dimension is that we have been seduced. I'm only talking about, say, Western civilization or Western humankind for the moment. We have been seduced in the modern age, and coming out of Christianity, to estimate highly the prospect of our individual freedom in being able to do what we like without strictures of the church or with some kind of doctrine, and then in just dealing with each other on the basis of what liberal thinking calls fairness. So fairness does come into it, but it goes hand in hand with the emergence of private property, which itself, private property being able, like possessing things of value, starting with land is really important, and being able to do with it what you want as an individual property owner, which in the first place, it just applies to the property owners, who are not the majority of society, but this freedom of property, which then becomes, it's the freedom of the consumer today. They go, they belong together in one piece. This being able to do what you want, you have a freedom in how you can dispose of what you own, and that is a real, like it's selling cocaine. It'll give you a high, and it's really great. It's just great.
It's pretty good.
It's pretty good. I have nothing against it other than its dark underbelly. Like we are seduced by that, but by being seduced by this freedom of property and seeing that this property is in a certain kind of movement, and this movement is what we call the economic movement of capitalism, then a lot depends upon how do we understand this thing we call capitalism as an economic system. And that's where you have something underlying that comes into appearance once it is conceptualized. And it has to be conceptualized extra because it likes to hide. It is what you could call the essence of capitalism. And that is where Marx again comes into play, because he is the one who then insistently asks, what is this capitalism? And he learns quite a bit from Hegel, and Hegel's thinking about the essence of things as opposed to their appearance, which is, it's an old motif of metaphysical thinking, to say that there is, behind the appearance of things, there is an essence. And Marx asks this question, what is the essence of capitalism? And he only comes to his own answer over a period of, from 1844 to say 1863. So it's quite a long time, where he actually comes step by step to what I have filtered out as what I regarded as his key concept, which is this verdinglichte Wert, which I translate these days as thingified value. That things come to have a value in themselves, but it's only because we evaluate them as such. And these things circulate and change their form from one look to another. So it's an idea in the Platonic sense, the look that something shows of itself. It changes. It can change. Like in the simple exchange of money for commodity, you can say that the look of money is transformed into the look of commodity, and vice versa. But with capitalism, you just you do not have simply markets with buying and selling. You have buying of labor power, which is hired out, and labor power receives its own look of value, which is called wages or salary or remuneration, whatever you want to call it. We'll just call it wages. So this is another look of value. So value has transformed itself from money, but it's not simply spent on commodities. It's spent on, first of all, buying labor power, which has its own look, which is thingified in wages, and then you have also in the means of production, because the capitalist is advancing this money capital in order to set up a production process with the help of labor power. So the means of production that the capitalist has to buy on the market is another look of this thingified value. And it needs a location to produce. The commodity that is produced then has to be sold on the market. And from the proceeds of this sale, there has to be a plus in there. It has to be a surplus value in there. Otherwise, the whole thing is a waste of time. But you have to have this circulating of the thingified value through its various forms, and I've only named three or four. The other ones are interest, which is a look of value which is paid to the financial capitalist who is lending money to the entrepreneurial capitalist, and the other one is for land, because you pay rent on land. So you've got this thing called ground rent, which is pretty much slipped out of view for most of modern economics, but it's nevertheless a look of value, and these things valued in such a way all fit together in an attempt by the entrepreneurial capitalist to actually make more out of it. So you've got, and that is what I call the law of movement of capitalist society. And I'm saying that you can regard the whole historical process starting in the 15th century, like with the Portuguese and the Spanish, and then turning in colonization of the entire globe. You can conceive that as the seeping of this medium of thingified value, which is accumulating or valorizing to the whole world. And that is the world in which we are living today, which is ruled. It is ruled by this principle of movement of thingified value as valorizing, that is, getting bigger and bigger and bigger without limit, because there's always a new circuit to go in. It never ends. It never ends and never ends. And this is what our globe has become under this law of movement, which is not a predictive law. Like it has nothing to do with the physical laws of a Newton or of an Einstein. It's not predictive. It is simply a principle. It's saying that if the thingified value going through its circuit, as advanced by the capitalist, doesn't come back with a plus, with a net profit for the capitalist, then that circuit will die. It has to increase and increase, and the principle itself, this principle itself is an iron principle. Like just otherwise things go really bad. But the problem with the principle itself is that it is premised upon an antagonistic relationship to the labor power that it has to hire, and also to the earth that it has to exploit. So it's an antagonistic principle from the start, because whatever the workers, in the broader sense, all employees all put together, lumped together, what they get as their wages, salaries, emoluments, whatever, that is a deduction from the possible valorization. It's a deduction. And also with the exploitation of the Earth's resources, because all that capital is interested in is in the exploitation of the Earth for the sake of producing this surplus. So to hell with the Earth in itself. It doesn't matter whether it's polluted, whatever. Any counter movement to this really ruthless exploitation of the Earth must come from somewhere else, but cannot come from capital itself. So it comes from a kind of resistance, say, of the society itself against that, with more or less.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost, yeah. I mean, that's a really nice description of it. And it reminds me almost like a real life version of one of those paperclip problems that you sometimes see when people talk about AI, the problems of AI. Well, it will just be very efficient at what it's told. And it's like this is an efficiency situation gone mad, where you have this valorization of value, and it's the only thing that matters. So all it does is valorize value, and whatever it takes to get that surplus, that's what it will do. Just like an AI would, if it was tasked with producing paperclips, use everything at its disposal to produce more paperclips until you have a catastrophe.
Yeah, and that's one of the fateful interconnections we have in the modern world. I mean, it's starting, this movement of valorization intermeshes so beautifully with increases in productivity. So it has to do with technological progress. So it harnesses this underlying, this eerie movement of the world, which is not seen as such, because it has to be, its concept to be seen as such, and it's denied. All we see instead is the superficial look is the look of personal freedom, the freedom of individual, personal freedom, freedom of private property, which is just great, and so on. But the underbelly of this underlying movement of valorization is not seen. And one of the great things about Marx is that he actually shows how these two things intermesh with each other, that to enhance valorization of thingified value, increases in productivity are very beneficial. So there's an enormous push, an urge, a necessity to improve productivity, and you don't really know why, except you say any enterprise, enterprise, large or small, which does not heed this imperative goes under. So it's enforced by the competition among the capitals, the enterprises. They are forced to keep cutting edge productivity, and it's always better to increase the productivity, because you're enhancing the valorization, the bottom line, as they say. And this is another kind of necessity, which seems to be a law of nature. Like there's often, you'd say on the surface in the gainful game, well, I've got to do this because of the competition. But what you're really doing there, I am enhancing the valorization of the underlying thingified value. No one will say that because it's not understood, it's not conceptualized, it remains secret. So capitalism lives from the ideology of freedom as private individual freedom, and it suppresses the coming to truth of the phenomena themselves. Like, this is where the phenomena themselves come into play, because we do not see the phenomena in themselves, that we have things of value, of thingified value, and this transformation of thingified value. Because we don't see those things clearly, we misunderstand our own position. in all this. So we're subservient to this valorization principle without knowing what we are servants of and subjected to.
Yeah, and so completely unfree. But when you talk about freedom, you have something more specific in mind. You're not against freedom in a deeper sense, right? You don't think that's a bad thing, I assume.
No.
You just think it's an illusion that we have freedom in the first place, this idea.
Yes, I think like freedom is a very multifaceted phenomenon. It's in itself. Like, and
Let me
I
say
always see
that,
freedom in relation to a kind of movement. So in the sense of like social freedom on the surface of society is a freedom to do what you like within the bounds or the rules laid down by intercourse with private property, so that you can shape your life. You can shape the life the way you want to within the bounds of these liberal rules of free and fair play. So that's just one kind of freedom. But the one I talked about, what I first talked about at the beginning, what we were talking about with the freedom of the mind, that is the most elementary kind of movement, I'd say. But it's also the most elementary kind of freedom that we are free to move our mind around this three-dimensional temporality. We are able to do that, which doesn't mean that it's always to our own benefit, because you can have crazy ways of thinking which are quite harmful, and you have very adequate ways of thinking which stick to the phenomena better. So you can have wide divergences. You can have misinterpretations of the phenomena that have disastrous consequences for human living, as well as having very good ones. So there's always a contestation of that, about what kind of freedom of the mind, what kind of ideas that the mind comes up with, and there's a cast as a part of an epochal mind, whether they are detrimental or beneficial. So there's an assessment going on there, but underlying that is the freedom of movement of the mind itself. So the freedom of the movement of the mind itself can be also dangerous. It is also, you've got to keep it in an eye on it. So it's always a critical moment in there.
That's good. No, I'm glad you clarified that, actually. So, because obviously it's going to require this elementary notion of freedom to shift the cast of being, right, that we currently have. Because you need to step outside of it. You need to not be constrained by it. And the only thing that is unconstrained is the thing that is elementary underneath it.
Yes, yeah. Like, that's what I mean by this Da Capo. One translation of that would be the step back. And what I say, as far as I can see now, after writing this book on human temporality, is that I can formulate or say what this step back, first of all, consists of, and that is the step back from linear time to three-dimensional time, by then opening up the vista of kinds of movement that are not physical, like opening up the vista that there are, that is the kind of movement which is social interplay, and opening up the possibility of seeing that this kind of violation or reduction of the freedom of interplay to the freedom of interplay that I call the gainful game, which is just out to make a profit, and to step back for that, to actually see this valorization of thingified value as something which concerns us all, and to really get that into clear view, because it is not in clear view. It's not because, like, you have the ideology of capitalism is, of course, to suppress any deeper insight into the essence or what this capitalism is, in favor of saying this is the freest of all possible worlds, which is the message we get from, from capitalists themselves. But it's also the seductive message of liberal society. So liberal political theory has a very long pedigree, a very long interesting history, and it's very Anglo-Saxon too. Like you have Adam Smith, a Scotsman. He's one of the main figures in this. And then you have Locke. Freedom is also enshrined the American thinking.
Mill.
There's a pursuit of happiness, which is in fact pursuit of private property. like they got rid of the Lockean formulation in favor of the wonderful American formulation of the pursuit of happiness. So that is the American dream. So it's a way, like, you're free to play the gameful game. Isn't that wonderful? We have freedom. And then you have the wonderful thing of John Stuart Mill. He's one of the kings, the thinkers of liberalism. Very, very important thinker. And you could say, well, this liberal thinking, it's very attractive. And I can say that I am and was very attracted to this liberal way of thinking. And for that way of thinking, it says that, okay, society is then based on a kind of intercourse, which I call interplay. And as long as this interplay is fair, then things are great. So we have to try to have the ideal kind of free society is the liberal society in which the interplay, starting with private property, is fair. So fairness becomes the conception of what constitutes the core of justice. The interplay has to be free and fair, so untrammeled, and also
it's tricky. It's tricky to define fairness, though. Of course,
very, very tricky. But it amounts on the fairness of the interplay, and the core of that is to say that in the interplay we estimate each other, and to say it is a fair interplay when each of us comes to an appropriate appreciation of the other. An appropriate appreciation of the other, and not a derogatory appreciation of the other from the get-go, for example. So that would be a bigoted society, an unfair society, and so on. And so the ideal of a liberal society is to say, well, we work toward, with the help of government, to make sure that the laws promulgated by the government are in line with preserving and furthering this fairness of interplay with one another in civil society. That would be the core of what we call a free society. And the problem with that is what I call the underbelly. Like, it's all very well, but seeing that private property, when it is properly conceived, brought to its concept as a phenomenon, you can see that private property is one of the looks of thingified value. And then we're in hot water again. So we have to confront that. We have to confront this. And it's first of all, it's not a political question. It's a philosophical question of how we actually bring this phenomenon to its concept and unmask the ideologies that cover that up. which says that capitalism is the best of all possible worlds, and look at all the freedom we have and all the stuff we have and all this stuff, which is what happens every day. This the ideological garbage which we are fed every day in the media, and with a critical eye on that, not to just look at the unfairness of the interplay as it is factually played out, and there's plenty of stories about that, and they are important to be told about how rotten the thing is under the surface, the unfairness of it all, but is to see that this unfairness is actually essential. It belongs to the principle of movement itself. This unfairness is baked into the principle of valorization itself, because human material,
it's operating correctly.
but human material is simply to be used. It has to be employed, and the more cheaply it can be employed, against the resistance or the non-resistance of the labour power, all the better. And the same with the earth. The earth is first of all defenceless, so it just gets ruined and ruined and ruined until people then start to step in, because they are losing their own way of life, and they're suffering the consequences, say in pollution. So the perniciousness of the principle of the movement simply has to be taken into view, but in a deeper way than saying, well, this is capitalist society. Like, every critical view of the world will refer to capitalism, or neo-capitalism, or predatory capitalism, or whatever. But I doubt that this deeper view of what capitalism is has come into view. So, and that is what I call the truth. This is the ugly truth, and it's hard to bear, because it makes short shrift of all our illusions of liberal freedom. It relativizes them to a great extent. So we have to be ready to then, again, a step back to see, this is not the best of all possible worlds, and we are in deep problem, and whether we can get out of it is, like, in a practical way, is one question, which becomes political, but also whether we can stomach it, to look that in the face and not kid ourselves that it's, well, that's the way it is, but at least we're getting along fine.
Yeah. Well, that will be the apocalypse, right? Is the unveiling of the truth of what we've been living in for all this time.
Yeah.
So I hope your next book, Michael, I assume you're always working on a book. Your next book will be how we get out of this. And sort of some governance issues, mate, because it obviously has to also be put into practice. The cast of being needs to be moved by somebody and by something, and ideas started, but then it requires actual things to be done, right?
Yeah, I would not be so foolhardy as to attempt that, because I don't think we're at a stage where we can actually envisage that, and I don't think we can run ahead and say, make any kind of political, practical proposals. Or I say the first step, and it's an historical step, is to say, let's see if we can do this step back and to see the truth of the phenomena, and whether we can, say, free ourselves through this step back, for example, from what we are now confronted with is this artificial intelligence being unleashed upon us in conjunction with the capitalism. Like it contributes to the gainful gain. And this AI is a consequence of how we have come to think about mental movement as somehow materially based, which can be impersonated or by a kind of algorithm. So you have to first come to think of the movement of the mind as some kind of syllogism, which has long since taken place because you got the germ of it already with Aristotle, but you then have it put into practice in a very beautiful, mathematically elegant way by Turing, with his idea of the Turing machine is nothing but an inferential machine based upon one binary number operating on another binary number, according to the rules of inference which are embedded in the algorithm. And once you start to think of the mind itself as this kind of algorithmic thing, like when you start to think of it in terms of these artificial neurons, which are juiced up Turing machines, they are just juiced up because you've got not just one input into the neuron, you've got several. And then you start to think, well, this is really how the human mind itself works. You kid yourself. And so that now the ideology has gone so far as to say that we have artificial intelligence now approaching or having surpassed the level of general human intelligence, which is the Holy Grail, but they presuppose that they've already done it or they're about to do it because you can measure and quantify the number of flops of a computer and whatever, or what it can do, all on the basis of a misconception of what mental movement is in the first place. So we're in really hot water, really hot water, and to take a step back from that and to say this is a hoax, and it is a hoax which is powered by not only the will to control all sorts of movement, but also the will to valorize capital endlessly. That is behind it. This infinite urge to valorize thingified value. It never lets up, and this artificial intelligence is today. It seems to be promising where this is really going to get it. This is the next stage. This is the next stage of valorization, big time, and you can see how big it is by the trillions of dollars now flying into this new way of valorization as the next big thing. Now they wouldn't be doing it without seeing the prospect of gain from it. But yeah.
Well, I think one of the problems is, it's not so much AI in the sense of, artificial sentient things that is problematic here. One of the main problems is the algorithmic control of humans, which you've also written about. So mining humans for their attention and essentially getting control over humans' minds, because there's so many billions going in to creating algorithms that are so perfectly attuned to your next move, right? It's not just large language models predicting the next word, it's the next behavior from humans.
Yeah.
That's the scary bit, because then they become part of this control system, and it's another different kind of thingified value, is the attention, the bit of attention.
Yes. Yeah, and the attention, apart from being able to influence behavior, the attention is what they call the eyeballs, on the advertising. And to say these empires, which we Google and Meta would be number 1 and 2, and just look at these are businesses that generate these super profits by advertising. The projected revenue for advertising from these two companies, Google and Meta, for next year or for the current year, is $243 billion from advertising. And advertising is what's there to catch your attention so that you get interested in wanting to buy something or other. So it's a way of manipulating and directing the way in which consumers spend their income. And that is a good business strategy for valorizing thingified value, which is never named as such, of course. It's not even understood. But it's certainly a way of generating profits, and that is what these giants, like Amazon comes into it as well, of course. And that's what they're peddling at the moment. That's the next big thing. And that's why the stock exchanges are still booming. They're reaching new highs every couple of days, despite a war in Iran.
Yeah, I know.
So it's time to take a step back and say, what the hell is this AI, and how does it fit? It's a kind of technology, so it's a way of enhancing productivity, but in a particularly pernicious way, because it's also a way of manipulating and advertising. You know, advertising is a form of persuasion, so you have to view it in line with the whole tradition of rhetoric. So it's a way of rhetoric is a way of saying stuff and showing stuff that is persuasive to somebody to point them in a certain direction. So that is the way in which artificial intelligence is not just being used to automate processes, which is being done to automate processes, and it is very efficient at doing that, and it will get better and better and better. And also, as you say, I mean, it's a way of surveilling people, improving techniques of surveillance, and also techniques of selling them stuff.
Yeah, hooking people, basically. It hooks people's minds.
Yeah.
And can move them in various ways. It can move them to have one completely different worldview, for example. It can turn them into people that see the world a different way. It can change the cast of being, in fact.
I wouldn't say it certainly changes the way in which we appreciate or depreciate each other. I mean, that is a major.
What I mean,
this denigration.
What I mean is that it could be.
Sorry.
One of its uses could be to change the cast of being. It's so well integrated with people's lives now that it could get control in that way and change the cast of being.
Yeah, I said, but the cast of being is at core. It has to be a philosophical task, a task of thinking through the phenomena and trying to come to an adequate interpretation of the simple phenomena. So I think that phenomenologists have their work cut out for them, and the question is whether this tiny little band of human beings who are kind of open to this kind of effort, because it is an effort. It's very, very difficult to sweep away one's own preconceptions of actually finding out that, well, that is not quite right. That isn't the way I thought about that. Isn't quite right. And hopefully to move away this debris of what we've been taught from childhood onward, and realizing that's not the bee's knees. That's not quite right. We've been told ontological lies, or I'd say temporological lies, like ways of thinking which obscure the phenomena. So I'd say the philosophers at least, or the phenomenological philosophers at least, I'd say are the ones who have a job to do. And I don't know about like the arts and so on. They are important. I do not want to undervalue them, but I'm just pointing out this task of thinking is it's central. Without it, we don't get nowhere. Like we have to do this kind of step back to see the phenomena more clearly, and to recast them. So for my way of thinking, which I've now made plain, I'd say that the first step in this recasting is to recast this elementary phenomenon of time itself, so that it becomes more open. that it becomes this openness of three-dimensional time. That would be step one as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, I think that's quite a nice place to close. Is there anything that you wanted me to ask or that you would like to say that didn't get said?
I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, like very, very briefly and very probably superficially, because you have to look into these. How do I try to actually explicate these things? How do I bring these phenomena to their concepts in a step-by-step way? And that's kind of like you've got to read a rather thick book. Although
yeah, I'll put
the
the
last
link
book,
books.
the on human temporality, on temporality, I have tried. It's not all that thick, like it's only that thick. It's slowed down. But the prolegometer to it is this thick.
No, leave that one. Okay. So, are you working on a book now? Are you working on another book before we go?
No, I'm not working on a new book, but I have done a rather nice revision of On Human Temporality. So that'll just lie on my hard disk for a while. I haven't got any plans to publish it, but it's kind of my thinking is still moving. Like I'm not dead yet, and so I revise and try to improve how closely I get to the phenomena that I have in view. And there's always something that I've missed. So, but it's a labor of getting to the truth of things. And that's what I regarded as the task of philosophy is it is the truth, to get to the truth of things, the deepest truth we can get at, and don't make do with less.
Very good. That is a nice line to end on. So thanks a lot, Michael, for giving up your time and your ology.
Yeah, thanks very much for the discussion, for the interchange, because